Great. Okay. It appears that it's on. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in room 1 of the first session. I'm here. It's okay. Thank you for joining room 1 of the first session of the Clarendon-Gates Symposium. My name is Justin. I'm a second-year Gates Scholar, and I'll be chairing the session, which is broadly kind of humanities and somewhat social science themed. So we're looking forward to a series of really great presentations from both Clarendon and Gates Scholars. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. I have taken it in my liberty as chair to cancel the Q&A section. Merely because I think after a 10-minute talk, we'll need the 2 minutes to kind of move things along, get the PowerPoint set up, give people a bit more flexibility. So I encourage you all with questions to kind of reach out to each other over lunch through contacts that people might have, just so we can have a bit more flexibility and to make sure that we end on time, which I think everyone would like. To the speakers, I've finally been prepared these slips with timekeeping instructions on them. I've chosen to discard 2 of them. I will just show the 2-minute one. I'll sit in the first row and try and make eye contact with you such that you know that you have 2 minutes remaining. Otherwise, I think this is fairly relaxed. So even if you go 1 to 2 minutes over time, no one is going to stop you, and it's going to be absolutely fine. Any questions before I introduce our first speaker? If not, it is my pleasure to introduce Hara Triantafilidou, who is a 4th-year PhD student and Gates Scholar. Her PhD is in theoretical and applied linguistics. Her area of research is in psycholinguistics and reading comprehension in bilingualism, bi or multilingualism. The presentation today is titled as on the screen, so I won't read it out any further. And without further ado, I pass it to Hara.
All right. Do we need the microphone or? All right. It's fine. Okay. I was felt said it would be okay. Just wanted to double check. First of all, linguistics is a hate crime, but I will accept it. All right, let's get things started. I'm Hara. I know some of you, familiar faces, some new faces. Yeah, I do know you. Yes, thank you. I work basically on the intersection between psychology, linguistics, and a bit of education. I'm going to be presenting a bit of a snapshot of my research today. I'll assume no or little to no prior knowledge in this presentation. So if there are any linguists in the room who would like more details, or if you keen on stats, despite them being fake and gay, as per the next presentation, you can very much come and nudge me afterwards and ask me all things about it. All right. So first of all, I mentioned the title implicit development, but how do we actually get there? Is that okay? Is that showing fine? It is perfect. And the first thing is decoding. It's how do we read a simple word, and you basically start with something that looks like gibberish at first, because we don't know how the alphabet or any writing system works. I did write the word that you will see next in doing things to make this happen, by the way. Then things start to slowly make sense, and characters started to make sense, but they don't really make sounds yet. At some point, eventually, you map those characters to sounds, and then those sounds come together to form a word which has a specific meaning. And that's the process of decoding, put in very simple, perhaps overly simplistic sounds, but so we're kind of on the same page. And eventually when that happens automatically, that meaning, that's character to sound to meaning mapping happens automatically, we're starting to be able to say that you can decode pretty A-okay. And some children will get to that stage and others will struggle. We will be focusing on those that do get to that stage. So we will not be covering, for example, dyslexic children. Although some of the research that is done in this study is very much inspired by research on dyslexia. Now, that's the first step to literacy development. There's obviously much more to it, but we want to get from decoding, from reading a single word, to comprehension. And that involves more than just decoding, automaticity, and fluency. The question is, what does it actually involve? So we have ample evidence that being able to understand what you read, in being able to understand what to read, vocabulary and grammar play a very important role. Obviously, if you want more details, I can give it later. But my focus here is on something that's fairly underwritten, that's prosody. Just to give a very quick explanation, when we talk about prosody, we sometimes try to define the music of speech. If I talk like this, I'm basically talking with no prosody in my language, I sound a bit like a robot. So prosody is not just something that gives emotion and expression to our voices, it also helps us understand what this speech stream means. It helps chunk speech into units that make sense. Babies use prosody as a main cue to acquisition because, well, speech does sound like a stream of nothing to them. Well, if you're a speaker of Greek, everything sounds like a stream of nothing, but point is you need those cues in order to understand what is going on in language. Now there is I would say substantial body of research showing us that in children with poor comprehension skills, whether they're dyslexic or they're just marked as poor comprehenders at school, there is a link there between prosody and reading. And that is mostly examined in the context of speech prosody or reading prosody. We want to dive deeper into that because prosody is a sort of multifactorial skill, multidimensional skill, and this is sort of key in this research. Now, beyond that, children also, happen to have a variety of different home environments or like what we usually call ecological factors in which they develop their skills. And there is evidence that their socioeconomic status and their reading habits can very much affect their literacy outcomes, their language outcomes, generally their educational achievement. And there's different ways in which we can measure those things. This is a big note about my study. We very much struggle to find valid ways of measuring socioeconomic status. There could be a separate whole discussion about that if that's something that's of interest. But we do have evidence that to get to the point of successful inclusive development, it's not just about cognition, it's not just about language skills, it's also the environment in which you're learning. Now, why did we choose to make this all about children who speak English as a language? About 1/5 of the pupil population in primary school in the UK is children who speak English as a language. Basically, children that have some other language other than English at home, or more than one. Studies up until 2020, at the very least, show a very consistent trend of these children struggling to develop their reading abilities. And usually those studies end with a note of, this is due to vocabulary and grammar, which again, as I said, they're key to developing reading skills, but the research usually ends there. And the research is usually done in, an educational context rather than linguistic one, which is of course very valid. And vocabulary and grammar are key to literacy achievements. So we know those, but we want to dive a little bit deeper into that. So because these are very well studied factors, we did include them in the research, and then we added more, and we had this massive testing battery. So in this study, we're studying primary school pupils in year 5. So these pupils are the level where they have developed their decoding skills pretty well. They can read the text, which is key, otherwise we won't be able to do our research altogether. It would completely scrap our study. But also they're not busy doing SATs, they're not in secondary school. We want to find that sweet spot about visibility of the study. So if you're wondering why year 5, it very much relates to visibility constraints. And we have 64 pupils. These all came from schools in Cambridgeshire, Peterborough, Ely, Cambridge, Tottenham, London. And to get to that sample, which I know looks a bit underwhelming, it took contact with 240 schools to make it happen. So another note on the feasibility of those studies if you want to connect data to schools. The mean age of acquisition is around 2 years. About 18 to 20 of those children were not born in the UK and arrived in the UK later. None of them arrived after year 3. This is mostly key for any research with children, it might be of interest. And they come from 22 unique language backgrounds. And what do we test? First of all, the key, reading comprehension. Of course, grammar, of course, vocabulary, then prosody, as I said, all those features of speech. Think of pitch, intonation, rhythm, and we can measure those both receptively, as in how do they use those as cues and how do they produce them as well. Their reading habits and their parents' reading habits as well. Language use and exposure, which is key for those EAL children, so we know what languages they're exposed to, how much do they use them in different contexts. And I'll show you, again, a snapshot of those results. So you'll see 3 columns of what happens in all of the children, what happens specifically in the monolingual, specifically the EAL. So first of all, very good news for our EAL kids. There were absolutely no statistical differences in any of the languages. They were doing fine. They were doing brilliantly, and we're very happy to see that. But then that bears a question as to why are they doing so well? Have they caught up in relation to kids in previous studies, or are we just testing very, well-developed children? What's the theme? And we find that all of those language measures are significantly correlated, which includes prosody. So there is a very clear link in our data between prosody and written comprehension. We very much established that in both groups. Again, no differences. Also, we've established with regarding to ecological factors, their reading habits predict performance in some language measures, but not all. And socioeconomic status was only found to predict grammar skills. In monolingual children, there's a slightly different picture. So with regards to reading habits, for instance, they predict different measures compared to the data set with all of the children in it. We also found a very interesting negative correlation between socioeconomic status and expressive prosody. We're still trying to interpret that result, in relation to the rest of the data set. Hypothesis might be that these children, because they might be in a high SES environment where they don't get to interact so much with family members or perhaps with people in their social circle so much, they don't develop those expressive oral skills because receptive prosody is doing just fine. With EAL children, we found most things are basically aligned, but no correlation between receptive prosody and vocabulary, which is actually really makes a lot of sense because their vocabulary level is also a marker of their proficiency, so there is a lot more variance there compared to monolingual children. Their reading habits only predicted their performance in vocabulary, and their parents' reading habit that only shows up in the EAL kids positively correlates with socioeconomic status. And that is, again, quite interesting because that's not found in the monolingual children. So there may be qualities in our data that are not accounted for that relate to socioeconomic status. It's kind of like a note for future studies. SES was definitely pain to interpret here. Some conflicting findings came up, and I would love to discuss them with anyone who's interested in diving deeper into it. But for now, we'll say we found what we think is a prediction of vocabulary and grammar on the basis of socioeconomic status. And also a very unsurprising finding: if you start learning English later, then you do worse in reading. Now, where does the statistical linguistic part come up? We had a eye tracking experiment where we basically wanted to see whether children are sensitive to commas and whether they can implicitly impose their own intonation phrase boundary right here when we don't give it to them. So we gave them a sentence without a comma, sentence with a comma, a reversed unambiguous theoretical sentence, and then a question to see how they respond to that, and also track their eye movements to that. I won't go too much into the linguistics of this sentence types because I think it's not of interest right now, but again, it's the kind of thing that I'm more than happy to chat about for anyone who wants to learn. A note about the findings is that, again, no group differences. EAL kids did just fine. However, as we expected, without the comma, they struggled much more to interpret the sentence. They were sensitive to the inclusion of the comma. We have evidence that they impose an implicit prosodic boundary when they read silently. The interesting part is that their performance and how they answer that question, which is an offline comprehension measure, significantly interacts with how well they do in prosody. And that only holds for when they don't do very well. So the children who struggle in prosodic skills also struggle in interpreting those two sentence types, with or without a comma. These two lines are parallel. So, in this case, I have clinical legend as well. But these are my two conditions with and without the comma. So there's not interaction with these conditions, but there is definitely a difference between the unambiguous and the ambiguous ones. When they get better at prosody, they get better at everything. So the interaction is not called when you're performing it around, 60-ish out of 100. Also, this interaction is not found until the grammar skills. Now, the last interesting part about this that I'm going to talk about very briefly, I know I'm running out of time, is that eye tracking measures which are very sensitive, we're talking about very short reading times or very specific regressions, were actually sensitive to how well children do in prosody, how well they do in grammar as well, and that actually explains the difference between the comma and no comma conditions. And also they interacted with the reading habit scores and socioeconomic status scores. So I think this is, to the best of my knowledge, the first time that we find a prediction of eye tracking measured on the basis of the ecological factors that affect children's upbringing. So we have found some quite evident strong links between prosody and reading. We also have evidence that the home environment really impacts sentence processing and language performance. And also we found surprisingly no evidence of the EAL children lagging in language development. So we're sort of going against the deficit account, which is a prominent literature right now. That's basically what we've done so far. We have another experiment, so if anyone wants to chat with me afterwards, I'm more than happy to talk about that as well. Yeah, that will be it for today. Thank you so much. And yeah, I think that was it. Thanks. No. Wait, I left my phone somewhere.
Next, I have the pleasure of welcoming Estella, who is a Clarendon scholar and a second-year PhD student doing a DPhil in history. Is that right? Great. Her area of research is in British legal, social, and cultural history in the 18th and 19th centuries. And today she is giving a talk titled Accessible for All in the Open Courts of 19th Century England, Present-Day International Academic Conferences.
I'm just wondering if anyone needs the microphone. Okay, so we're good. As you can see here from my title, this talk I'm going to give today is quite a bold attempt to connect the historical research with my lived experience in attending academic conferences. And I confess it's the first time I've ever brought together these two issues. And the Clarendon-Gates scholars today offer the best audience I could possibly ask for, in no small part because of our amazing diversity. So I will start by sharing a personal anecdote. At the very start of my PhD, I was scheduled to present a paper at an international conference in a country where I had previously lived for 4 years during my undergrad. I was well aware of the long visa processing time, so my parents and I did not even wait for my acceptance to prepare the ridiculously long list of documents required. And we submitted the visa application 6 months ahead of the conference. Still, the visa remained pending, and I never received it in time for the conference. And at the end, I only received it 6 months after the conference has closed. I was shocked on this occasion by the widespread surprise and lack of awareness among scholars in my field of British history about the visa challenges which I and many other scholars from the global south have faced. Many academics I spoke with have never encountered a visa barrier when attending conferences. This experience was just the beginning of my visa challenges. I'm sure many scholars here today would have similar and even more challenging experiences, especially in today's ever-changing and ever more demanding visa systems. It was not until I started brainstorming ideas for this conference that I realized just how much my own experience had in common with the very subject that I studied, the experiences of the public as spectators in the lower courts of 18th and 19th century England, many of whom were quietly excluded from the life of the courtroom, despite the time-honored principle of open courts of justice. Just to give you a bit of context on my academic work, the justice system in England prides itself on opening its courtrooms to the public scrutiny, and my DPhil research has shown that from the late 18th to the mid-19th century, attending trials as spectators has become increasingly common and popular as a leisure activity that was both educational and entertaining. High-profile trials, such as some of the sensational murder trials or treason trials, were held in courtrooms that were crowded to excess, as you can see from this cartoon here, and or in the words of Charles Dickens, with human faces paved from floor to roof. Despite the much prized openness of English law courts and widespread enthusiasm in attending trials, first-hand access to courtroom proceedings on the ground was problematically restricted. For much of the period that I studied, London's Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, still has the name today, the Old Bailey, had this very disgraceful tradition of charging the public for admission to enter its public galleries. The fee operated on a sliding scale, ranging from a shilling in the most unremarkable cases to a sovereign, which is like equivalent of £1 in extraordinary trials. But you can see a rough translation of a sovereign into today's currency here. The charge to attend a hypothetical high-profile trial in 1850 at the Old Bailey cost around twice the registration fee for this conference. So, as you can imagine, this fee would have prohibited a substantial segment of the working class population from observing justice firsthand. Unfortunately, due to a two-tiered admission system where the privileged could directly apply for seats on the bench or in the well of the court, these obstacles faced by the indignant working-class Victorian spectators was largely invisible to individuals with the most influence in and over the system. The same self-perpetuating cycle of spatial exclusion is evident in today's academic conferences. From their inception, most international academic conferences have been designed for and by scholars with privileged passports. While the academy has become more diverse and inclusive, the structures and expectations of academic conferencing have not kept pace. The result is a pervasive yet often invisible form of academic gatekeeping, where scholars with the Global South passport, who already have to overcome significant hurdles to access the same space as their peers from the Global North, have to pour extraordinary amount of time, money, and emotional energy into navigating opaque visa system, mostly on their own and at their own cost, only to repeat the access all over again for each trip and conference. Consequently, many of us have become highly selective about which overseas conference to apply to, and this has the unintended consequence of further keeping ourselves invisible to the global stage of intellectual exchanges. I couldn't possibly start to describe the complexity of these applications, but I will try here. Firstly, we have to gather an extensive list of documents required, which quite conveniently differs for each trip and country. Often we have to wait months to get an appointment to travel to London or Manchester or some faraway city to submit biometrics information or attend interviews. There's no standard procedure. A lot depends on our nationality, country of residence, travel destinations, our travel family and immigration history, our field of research, and even our supervisor's field, and especially our finance. How well our records fare in the immigration system is often far beyond our control. Moreover, countries with quicker processing times often have bottlenecked appointment systems where securing an appointment sometimes feels like winning a lottery, while others, despite a very streamlined online application system, may take months or even years to process even temporary visitor visa applications. Above all, the system constantly evolves, often with sudden changes in rules, processing times, and additional requirements, adding more demand and uncertainty to an already unpredictable and highly labor-intensive process. Although a lot is beyond our control, there is still much we can do to help one another. It can start with simple yet meaningful gestures, such as acknowledging the reality of visa barriers in opening or closing speeches at conferences. For scholars who have experienced the visa obstacles firsthand, or we can speak up by sharing our stories with our peers, mentors, and conference organizers, and always be ready to offer insights and suggestions for potential support. For those without such an experience, be an ally. Listen and learn about structural hurdles your colleagues and students face. There are many ways to help. Initiating a panel or poster session dedicated to discussing visa barriers at a major conference in your field, or inviting scholars with first-hand experience with this issue to share their experiences. International conferences could also consider involving scholars facing visa challenges in the venue selection and conference planning. At the very least, organizers should learn about and keep visa timelines in mind at every step of conference planning. Besides offering letters for visa purposes, conferences could help further by allocating additional funds for visa applications and collaborating with the immigration or international student offices of the host institutions to provide tailored support. It is also important to recognize that while hybrid conferencing seems to be a convenient solution, it risks create a two-tiered participation. A more inclusive and environmental friendly approach may be to integrate hybrid with live conferencing distributed across multiple hubs where participants at different sites can access all parallel sessions while interact in real time during session breaks through video conferencing. And this experience in the future can even be enhanced with the use of virtual reality and augmented reality to create a more immersive experience. In the end, while we as academics cannot fix the system alone, we can start by listening, advocating, and building a more inclusive academic community where no scholar is repeatedly left out because of their passport. Thank you very much.
We just keep going and then I'll bring it back. I'm very pleased now to introduce Mathis, who is a second-year PhD student and Gates scholar who is working on a PhD in classics. He's currently studying ideas of place, self-representation, and migration in late antiquity, and today is presenting on the topic another author, Migrant Voices from the 4th Century. Thank you so much, Justin. Thank you very much to the organizers for these amazing space to hear about other topics and interact with them. And thank you so much to the previous papers as well. Am I audible? Right, you let me know. I have to switch to the microphone. So what I wanted to talk today about is a sort of the broader background of the project I'm working on. So I'm actually studying a particular author from the 4th century CE, but what I'm looking at is the way he describes different cities that feature in his autobiographical work. So this author, Gregory of Nazianzus, who wrote quite a lot about his own life. He was almost obsessed with presenting himself, his own career as a bishop within the Christian church, and with the path that he led throughout his life. And in that autobiographical material, place takes up quite an important position. Now, what I want to talk about is the broader background of narratives about different places and about migration in the 4th century CE. One of the things that you often hear when interacting with a broader audience and introduces yourself as someone studying within classics is the question, why should we care? Now, what I try to answer today is not necessarily some response to that question. Rather, I want to take that question from a different angle. Let's start from the modern concepts around migration, and then look back, is there any difference in antiquity, and especially late antiquity, so the 4th century CE, the period I'm working on. Now, I'll maybe start with a sort of more modern introduction first. So when late antiquity features in modern political conversations is, of course, quite a rare moment, and also one that scholars in late antiquity notice. So I want to refer here to a tweet that J.D. Vance sang January 30, where he talked about the concept ordo amoris in a conversation about migration. So the ordo amoris is a concept that was introduced or discussed by Augustine in the 5th century, so slightly later than the period I'm working on, but an early Christian consideration of how love is almost concentric, and you should start with the first interaction, according to Augustine, that have the primary order is the love you have with God, and then you should move out in different concentric circles. Now, J.D. Vance interpreted this quite literally and discussed this as a way in which there should be a different form of love and a different quantity of love that you feel towards your direct neighbor and to those people more outside. And I should mention that this is also partly influenced by some of the work that someone in the Faculty of Divinity in Cambridge, James Hall, who's J.D. Vance has called his British guru. Now, interestingly, the former Pope Francis issued a statement where he suddenly felt the urge to American bishops to explain the concept of the ordo amoris and to talk about migration more
widely. And especially because migration was a topic that Pope Francis used as almost his sort of focus of his papacy. He also published, in the year before he died, an autobiography, which opens with a long description of the migration story of his family. So it's something that resonated probably personally with the former Pope as well. And even the recently appointed Pope, Leo XIV, also links to an article on the Order Amoris in response to J.D. Vance. Now, why I'm saying all this is because there are two things I'm interested in here. Well, firstly, is that the fact that classics still resonates in modern day context, and that in studying classics, we should also be aware of that, and we should also acknowledge that anything we study is perceived or is part of a broader political discourse and is part of a broader societal discourse in our own time. It's not because we're studying a period that feels distant and far away that doesn't have implications on modern day politics, or that it cannot be used by modern day politicians. Now, secondly, I'm also interested in the debate around migration here, because we was using theological concepts from a different era to talk about what the ethics of migration and the concept of migration. Now, to return back to the historical context, the 4th century has often been deemed an age of mobility. So the stereotypical narrative that has been challenged in the recent scholarship, anyway, the stereotypical narrative is that in the 5th century, the decline of the Roman Empire, the city of Rome falls, and part of that, and in some studies even the main reason for that, is because you have migrations of different peoples who move from outside of the Roman Empire into the Roman Empire. So as I said, that idea and the importance of migration has been challenged, and this is not one single moment in history where there suddenly was an increase in migration, but it's a more long-term development where from earlier onwards there were always interactions between those living within the Roman Empire and those living outside of its borders. Now, while this sort of broader historical context is happening, there's also an increase in the narratives of migration that we have preserved from this period. And that second element is actually what I'm more interested in and what I will also talk about, because in essence, I'm more of a literary scholar than a historian. So we get in the 4th century, we get the first stories of people living on pilgrimage. So talking about their religious journey and explaining that within literary works. But at the same time, we also see that the idea of mobility creeps up in a lot of other works. Now, one important consideration to make there is because these people are talking about confident narratives or are using the idea of mobility within their works, does that mean that they are talking about migration? Now, as any concept, of course, it's based to think about the history of a concept. And an important question, and one to which I don't have a definitive answer, but would just like to raise a question, is whether there is an important difference between our modern perception of migration and later the forms of mobility. What we consider to be migration is often contrasted with other forms of mobility because it is a long-term move to normally a different nation state. Now, in late antiquity, there weren't any nation states. Nation states is an idea that, especially in the Western form, only really developed in the 19th century. So if you don't have nation states, but you have this big Roman Empire which has its borders and does have physical borders as well, but anyway, you have a broad empire within which people can move relatively freely, does that still mean that if you move from one place within that empire to another place, you suddenly become a migrant? And do you acquire a different form of identity when you move from one place to another? Or are you just someone who has a different language and is traveling? In other words, is there less of a difference between traveling, being a tourist, just going to somewhere to visit family or people you want to speak to, and the concept of a migrant? And bearing in mind also that any form of traveling that you would undertake would have taken you much longer than it would today. Now, to finally turn to the narratives then. So one of the narratives is an author called Libanius, who writes an oration. His first oration is an autobiographical narrative of his life. And I'll just read the first bit. So I made landfall at Piraeus, and then at one of the harbors of Attica, where I got back for the night. The next night, I was in Athens, in the hands of people I wanted none of. And the day after, I was in the hands of other people, and these I wanted none of either. I was unable even to catch a glimpse of the teacher from whom I had come to learn, for I was cooped up in a cell about as big as a barrel, such is the reception they give students on their arrival. My teacher had lost me and I him, so we began to set up a hullabaloo from our separate stations. My captors, however, took no account of our outcries. I was kept in the lock and key until I took the oath, like any Aristodemus, assuming there was. After I had sworn the oath to put up with my present condition, the door was opened and I began to attend the lectures of Diophantus as his regular pupil straight away, and those of other two according to normal practice of public declamation. So there are a lot of detailed references that do not really matter to us here now, but what I'm interested in is this is the story that Libanius is telling when he traveled to Athens to study there. Now, if we read this with our modern eyes, this really looks like the practicalities, and in that way it also links to one of the previous presentations, practicalities of the immigration of the Southerners going to a different place and being subjected to the control of the state in that sense. And that certainly is part of what is the background context. There were rules about who could become, for example, an Athenian citizen, but at the same time, I think it is also important that Libanius is talking here about this experience as part of his experience as a student studying in a different city. And this is going back to raising the question, is there, because we normally make a distinction between student mobility, or what many of us are doing, who have a busy visa specifically for studying or undertaking scholarship at the university, and people become migrants and are thought to have an interest in staying in a country for a longer time. I'll probably skip this and go straight to some of the, to this quote. Now, this is the author I'm actually working on, and this is a different form of migration that I just want to hint at the end of my presentation. In this quote, Gregory is talking about his reception in the new capital, Constantinople, city that is nowadays Istanbul. And there, Gregory is talking about his reception as an outsider in this capital, where he's comparing his the hostility that he received as almost people asking him to integrate within the city and to ask from a dolphin to become a land animal. He says, I cannot become a part of the city as you would require me to be. Now, what is important here, I think, is the idea of metaphorical migrants. So you're not necessarily always traveling in a physical way, but you can also use the idea of not feeling at home or being a stranger in a more metaphorical way. And that links back to the point I was making earlier in response to J.D. Vance's use of theological concepts from Augustine as well. Because an important conception of Augustine is actually that he sees Christians as migrants on the world. The idea is that Christians have their actual fatherland in heaven, and the lands they live on earth are only temporary fatherlands. So in that sense, actually, also J.D. Vance, who used Augustine as a way of thinking about migration within Augustine's perception, probably be called a migrant, which raises questions about how we use the concept of migration and what that concept means. Thank you very much. Alex was in his long and esteemed journey down from Leviticus. Yeah.
It is my pleasure to introduce Alex, who is a third-year PhD student and Gates Scholar, currently doing a degree in German. He has a focus on digital humanities and, from his profile, of phenomenological understanding of virtual and
Ooh. I did say that one point, yeah.
Today, he is presenting on the topic Kafka, the modernist art machine, critical reflection on generative art.
Okay, hello everyone. Yes, as already said, my name is Alex Menzel, and I, broadly speaking, research the development of novel technologies but through a cultural lens. So I'm especially interested in the potential resonances of the kind of modernist period at the turn of the 20th century and how the structures of labor and power and creativity that were identified then might still resonate in the kind of digital and AI-driven futures that we're encountering now. But today I'm just going to zero in on sort of a small strand of my research, which is a certain theory of images and machines that emerges in the literature of the Jewish Czech Austrian novelist Franz Kafka. And I'm going to weave that with a kind of recent explosion of data-driven art that we're seeing with the rise of Gen AI, and an old but I think still useful word, kitsch, to ask what counts as creativity and meaning in the age of big data. But before we launch in, just a little pulse check. I'd be really interested to see if you could raise your hand if you use an AI chat box, sort of generally. Wow, yeah, okay, so now keep them up if you use it primarily for work. So writing emails, that kind of thing, research reports. And keep them up if you use it primarily or as well as for like creative things, poem writing, visualizing, imagery, anything like that. Yeah, okay, so, you know, I mean, this is not a representative sample necessarily, so the STEM people would tell me, but I think it's still interesting to see how these technologies are kind of being adopted and the line that's blurring between utility and creativity, although it seems to lean a little bit more towards utility in the room today. So in 2008, the technologist Chris Anderson wrote an article, or published an article in Wired magazine called The End of Theory, which he christened the age from 2008 kind of onward as the age of the petabyte, where sheer data volume kind of has rewired how we think and create. And a petabyte is very large. This graphic is convenient and helpful for me, but it's roughly 1 million gigabytes. And that now, though, is processed by the dozens daily at kind of large tech companies like Google. And this phenomenon leads Anderson to argue that such scale fundamentally changes how we approach knowledge, even to a level that undermines a kind of old epistemic model of scientific discovery and human creativity. It's a bold claim. And he says statistical patterns are kind of outplaying causal models. So in this regime, mathematics replaces theory. The numbers are able to speak for themselves. And he uses Google's advertising business as a kind of paradigmatic example of that. And I would say that the rapid spread of generative AI platforms could be argued, so that these are like OpenAI's DALL-E, Google's Imagen, Midjourney. You could say that this maybe amplifies this development that Anderson has identified, signaling a kind of accelerated replacement of traditional forms of representation by products that are generated on the basis of big data. And this signals a transformation in representation that the 20th century German cultural critic Walter Benjamin might have seen as sort of the ultimate loss of artistic aura in the age of now digital and his kind of technical reproducibility. So instead of depicting reality, right, these Gen AI images are stitched together out of data. And often you see critics and others identifying the result as kitsch, in the sense that the art critic Clement Greenberg, his kind of widely accepted definition from the 1960s, which is slick, derivative mashups of an already mined culture. So these images are imitating life and art, but they remain sort of trapped hermetically in systems of algorithmic instructions and outputs, and therefore lack any kind of profound meaning. This is what we accuse Gen AI images of being when we say that they are kitschy. But I would argue that the problematics of representation that we're seeing in these products from these art machines is maybe not been sufficiently explored. So why do I turn to Franz Kafka, a novelist of high modernity, as a way of examining this kitchification in the age of digital reproducibility? Well, first, there's his own well-documented kitchification as an author. His image has been commodified and takes form on mugs, t-shirts, and other souvenirs, which kind of subjects his own cultural iconography to a form of cultural kitsch. These are some of my favorite examples. There's Kafka's shadow as the bug from the Metamorphosis on an Etsy shop. Here's some pins you can buy at another Etsy shop. This is the Kafka head statue in Prague, which kind of rotates. All these silver things kind of rotate in the wind. Very smooth, very glossy, very kitschy. This is me participating in it with a book called Kafka's Prague, which is a travel book to seeing the city through the eyes of Kafka's kind of cultural outputs. But there's also been a strange digital afterlife to this Kafka kitsch. So you see headlines like this in the Daily Mail, he is my bare minimum, becomes an unlikely heartthrob on TikTok, and even in the New York Times, the very online afterlife of Franz Kafka. I think just this little TikTok bit is quite fun as well. I don't know if this will play. Yes. Oh, we don't have any audio. Okay, well, that's fine. I'll describe it. Basically, you see Kafka transformed as a moody heartthrob, where they use AI-generated voiceovers from his letters that he wrote to Milena, laid over a kind of carousel of imagery. Oh, yeah. Okay. These are available, but basically, it's a very dark academia interpretation of Kafka, and very romantic and very widespread. But it kind of evokes and aestheticizes this feeling of alienation, anxiety, and guilt that are present in Kafka's texts that somehow feels very digital. And you see that in the kind of adoption of him as a trope in the digital cultural space. So, if Kafka as an author can be flattened maybe into a sort of decor, provocative statement, I don't know if I'm actually even going to stand by it, but I wonder then if kitsch is less a category, but more kind of a gravitational pull that we see in mass culture. And I've been pulled into it as well. Last year, I was presenting on one of Kafka's novels, The Man Who Disappeared, also known as his America novel, which tracks a young immigrant by the name of Karl Hoffmann through this kind of imagined American landscape of exploding urban spaces, labyrinthine service corridors, and luxury hotels. And it concludes in this space called the Nature Theater of Oklahoma, which I will come to more in just one second. And I fed some descriptions of the Kafka text into DALL-E, just kind of out of curiosity, and we got these images. And I presented them, and the reaction was very polarizing. Most really kind of saw the aesthetic touch points in these as kind of like M.C. Escher-derived structures over there, and the kind of glossy surfaces. Yeah, I sort of said, this is just pure kitsch, is it not? And this is relevant in kind of other contemporary moments as well. I would invite you to consider Beeple's $69 million NFT kitsch collage from 2021 called The First 5,000 Days. And also N+1's more recent essay called Why Is Everything So Ugly from 2023. And I think both of these kind of reveal the havoc that can be wreaked by plundering the past in pursuit of the new, which arguably might be the very structure of Gen AI images themselves. So kind of out of this, I'm interested in two primary questions. How does Kafka help us judge the flood of generative images themselves? And second, if Kafka himself is now merch, is now kitsch, does that cancel his critical bite as a literary figure? Or can the process of imitation generate own forms of resistance? So I'll start with the second consideration. These 6 questions, I'm not going to read them all out loud, but they were kind of posed in 1990 at a famous conference at Skidmore College on kitsch. And I think they're still really relevant to mapping the sort of terrain that we live in the cultural space. And throughout the 20th century, you saw various critics from Greenberg, already mentioned, to Susan Sontag in Notes on Camp, to Milan Kundera in The Eternal Lightness of Being, kind of debate kitsch. And it takes a lot of different forms in these critical models. Harmless entertainment, fascist tool, denial of reality. But 2 charges endure, right? Kitsch commodifies feeling, and it churns out a counterfeit aura, an echo of authenticity that's been stripped of context. So I would say my question is, are these outputs that we see in Gen AI just new variants of the same pitch? Or, as Benjamin hopes, fragments that invite critique and reinvention? So I want to just very briefly mention how text-to-image engines work, which is that they translate sort of prose into pictures via a process known as diffusion. And they work by first destroying their training data with successive layers of visual noise, and then learn how to undo that process and recover images from that noise. It's sort of like a pointillist painting, but in reverse, where dots materialize very quickly rather than a process of many years. And I think that prompting an image is a strangely literary experience as well, right? You're sort of trying to describe something that doesn't exist and make it understandable to the mind, such as it is of a computer. But despite that, AI-generated images can still have a strange beauty. These kind of caught my eye, and I think this one especially has a kind of a neo-Rauchian aspect, sort of social realist, mythical, yet strangely drained of joie de vivre. I'm going to skip this slide. This is sort of my take on why the AI-driven kitsch might not fit into completely old, like the 20th century model of it, because it might be a little bit closer to something that could be thought of as weird or uncanny. And I just want to end with Kafka again, which is that I think that he kind of gives an early blueprint for how spectacle can hide power structures. And in the conclusion of this America novel, the protagonist gets to this theatrical space where a billboard promises jobs for everyone. They say everyone is welcome in this theatrical space. And he encounters these kinds of very kitschy aesthetics as a result. Women dressed as angels on these plinths, very kind of glittery set dressing. And I think that what Kafka is doing here is he's treating kitsch more of a diagnosis. When a surface is so smooth that it feels fake, it kind of is telling the reader to ask, who built this? Who benefits from this structure? And in Kafka, the theater's open arms slogan, right? Everyone is welcome, masks a kind of rigid hierarchy. Once the hired performers actually lose control of their roles and they're assigned by the theatrical machinery. And in digital culture, creative AI tools promise a similar kind of inclusion. Anyone can generate AI art, but they also lock us into systems that are not fully understandable. So as a sort of final provocation, I think that it's useful to sort of look back at some of these models that we've encountered in the past for trying to understand the cultural aesthetics that are emerging today. And I think Kafka's example kind of underscores the critical force that might lurk in forms of artificiality. So this is my small little defense for AI art is still being critically usable. You see artificiality as a sort of force that detects and diagnoses the illusions of modernity, but from within. And by recognizing this diagnostic potential, we might approach AI's uncanny outputs not as failed art, but as illuminating exposures, contradictions that are embedded in the picture. Thank you.
Is online, so let's
Kabir, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Could you try to share your slides, please?
Absolutely. It says someone else is sharing. So
Someone else is share. Oh, yes. I have to. Can you try it again now?
yep. Is it working now?
Yes, 1 second, please. We want to share. Okay, perfect.
Great. So I now have the pleasure of introducing our last and final speaker for the session, who is joining us from online, Kabira, who is a fourth-year PhD student and Clarendon scholar, completing a DPhil in education. Kabira is interested in improving learning outcomes for children in fragile and conflict-affected regions of the world. He's also interested in school health and nutrition programs, as well as combating gender-based violence and supporting children who are dealing with addiction. And he is today presenting on improving learning outcomes in fragile and post-conflict
countries confronting the face of taking goals. Over to you, Priya.
Thank you so much. Uh, I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there in person, but I hope to be back in Oxford next month. Anyway, I'm going to try and keep this short and hopefully have an opportunity for some interaction, maybe a couple of questions if that works. Um, I thought a lot about what to present. I was thinking maybe I should present a little bit about my recent work or a little bit about my research. So I'm going to try and do a bit of both. But let's get started. Now, um, we all know that learning poverty levels are quite high, and they are even higher now after the pandemic, particularly because in a lot of places, schools were shut down for a prolonged period of time. So the estimate that we have from the bank is that 57% of children in low and middle income countries were unable to read and fully comprehend a simple age appropriate text by the time they were 10 years old. Recent estimates are closer to 70%, and 72%, I believe, is the latest number that I saw from the bank a couple of weeks ago. So, when we talk about these things, it can feel quite alarming. And there's a lot of discussion about what are we going to do about it. And what's interesting is that a lot of this discussion seems to be focusing on, okay, let's just correct information asymmetries, help parents understand, the returns to education. And the market will kind of take care of this. Parents will realize, oh, actually, education is really important, and they'll invest more in their child's education. Otherwise, there's a lot of discussion about quality early childhood education. And then those are the two things that you see a lot of officials, even at the bank or UNICEF and a lot of these organizations talk about. But it's not like it seems to suggest that parents don't know how important education is, which at this point in time, is a highly contested worldview. Also, a lot of times, the kind of role that nutrition plays and the role that psychoactive substances play in impairing learning outcomes seems to be completely overlooked. We focus a lot on vaping and marijuana, but again, at the high school level. But we are not talking about the psychoactive substances that are consumed at a much younger age in particularly in South Asia and parts of the Pacific. So that's the kind of area that I'm focusing on right now. This is what I've been studying for the last few years now. It's called the betel nut or green gold. It's the fourth most consumed psychoactive substance in the world. 800 million people chew it every day. Even in Oxford, you just have to walk down to Cowley Road and you're going to be able to find betel nut for the people who are incredibly used to having it. In a few countries, it's been banned, including Australia, New Zealand, the United States, the UK, not so much. So you can still find it here. People dip a mustard stick and have it with this thing. This is lime powder. So you basically dip the buai in with a mustard stick and lime powder. And if y'all have seen this, red spit, this is kind of like a very common way of what it looks like when someone is chewing betel nut. So then they spit out in South Asia, at least like, the parts where I come from, you'll find this everywhere, particularly at train stations and so forth. What does it do? It creates like this sense of euphoria and agricultural harvests that have been like bumper crops since the 1970s, since we started having mechanized agriculture, has led to an absolute explosion of boy production. So what you would earlier find is that these things were reserved for ceremonial events. Children would rarely chew it, but from the 1970s onwards, suddenly everyone is chewing it more and more and more. In the Pacific, it is 72% of parents chew it every day, and the Pacific has the highest rate of mouth cancer primarily because of buai chewing practices. What does this have to do with education and young children? Alarmingly, young children chew it quite often as well. So this is actually a typical classroom in remote parts of Papua New Guinea. I took this photograph when I was living there for an extended period of time. And what happens is that 22% of children in early childhood education centers chew buai on a daily basis. By the time you get to elementary school, grade 1, grade 2, 40% of children are chewing it every day. By the time you get to secondary school, it's 63%. And there was a recent study that was done that found that 13% of children, by the time they reach secondary school, already have precancerous lesions. Research about the impact that buai has, you would imagine that there would be a lot of research about it, given that 800 million people are chewing it every day, but that's not really the case. And that's not really the case because it's not something that happens that often in the global north. It's something that is ubiquitous in parts of India, southern China, South Asia, and then the Pacific. So it's only recently that a lot of research, almost exclusively from China and Taiwan, is coming out about how harmful betel nut is. So you see this explosion of research that starts after 2016, 2017, looking at how it affects short-term memory, functional connectivity in front-end default networks, gray matter, and all the rest of it. What I do is I embed questions about nutrition and betel nut use in large-scale learning assessments. That's the only way to get good data about this. And I do this across the Pacific and even across parts of Africa, where I look at how psychoactive substances might be impairing learning outcomes. So when you do that, you find a very clear difference, even after controlling for all the relevant covariates, you find very clear kind of connections between who's chewing and how they are performing in academia. These results will be consistent across the early childhood education sector, the elementary sector, as well as grade 5. So consistently, no matter what assessment you conduct, you find that these results hold. And no matter what specification you throw in, you control for the mother's chewing status. You control for the mother's chewing status at birth. You control for economic factors, early childhood education. It doesn't matter. It's very, very clear that children who are chewing betel nut, either on the day of the assessment or consistently, tend to perform between 3 to 4 percentage points lower on these assessments. I can go on about what causes these things, but just very quickly, within a minute, what recently research is showing us is that it's affecting your memory, it's affecting your attention. It creates this feeling of high, but then it leads to a period of fatigue. And that primarily happens when these children are supposed to be sitting and paying attention in the classroom. So they've been high for a while, and then they're basically kind of suffering from withdrawal effects. There are anxiety and hand tremors that happen, which again is going to impair how you perform in the classroom. Oral health, of course, when you have precancerous lesions, your tooth decay, you're not going to be concentrating on the classroom. And the nutritional factors are again very, very interesting because it's a sleep as well as appetite suppressant. So these children are basically hungry in class and are not getting enough nutrition just because then once they chew it, they don't feel hungry, at least temporarily, and then they don't take in any nutrition for the rest of the day. It also affects their sleep. So it's quite a big issue affecting lots and lots of children across the Pacific, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. And it is quite alarming that a lot of research hasn't been done about it, or even about how school feeding affects learning outcomes. again, very, there's more research about that, but again, coming mostly from India and parts of the global south. So it is interesting when research kind of shifts to these centers rather than places where these are not historically problematic. Anyway, happy to answer any questions that you all might have had. Thank you for your time. I really, really wish I could have been there. The conference talks sounded absolutely exciting. Thank you.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. I know we haven't really done Q&A in the session so far, but given that you're not with us today, I do open the floor if there are any questions. I guess I'll ask one, Kabira, and then we can close out the session, which is that I think you presented some really compelling evidence about the impact on educational outcomes. But I guess on the flip side, what is the upside, or where do we go from here, really? Because I think it's a practice that in many ways is embedded in both social and cultural customs as well. So how do we move forward with the knowledge that you've produced about the impact of it?
I mean, that is a really, really important question, and thank you for that. And I understand that people would actually have to go for lunch, so I'm going to be super quick. But I've given that a lot of thought, right? Like it's a cultural practice. It's also an economic issue. It's the number one cash crop. And it is generally women, right, who come from the lowest income quintiles who are supporting themselves by selling buai. And they're selling buai outside classrooms, outside schools. So there's an economic angle to this as well. And it's also something that parents, when they hear about the research, they feel incredibly upset about because they realize that they've been allowing their children to chew for a really long time. So there's a lot of resistance to even acknowledging that this research is accurate. In India, it's almost completely, shut down. People, there's a huge lobby for betel nut producers to actually advertise everywhere. Alcohol and cigarette advertisements are not allowed, but you can advertise for Buai fine across everything, including cricket matches. So this is the issue that we're dealing with. How do we actually go about reducing prevalence rates for chewing? And we've been looking at community-based education programs and school-based health interventions. There's been a lot of resistance to that as well. There's actually a person from Taiwan who recently moved to PNG to run such a program. And what they found 6 months later is that people actually increased chewing because they found that they were protesting against this foreigner and coming in and telling them that chewing buai was bad. So it has to be handled very delicately. There have to be very, very specific ways in which we do this across every country. You need like hyper specific initiatives. Something that works in India is not going to necessarily work in Taiwan or in Papua New Guinea. Anyway, thank you so much for that question.
For shedding some light on this complexities. Just a round of applause for all of our speakers this morning. It has been a pleasure to hear from everyone. And as I mentioned, please do reach out to each other over lunch, over the rest of the day, and interact more on the research we're hearing about. Lunch is out this way, kind of where the refreshments were this morning.